Okay, we're live.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final session of Scholars Strike Canada 2023, Teaching and Learning Against Social Abandonment. Today's session, Beyond the University, Reflections and Imaginations, closes off the two days of the Scholars Strike Canada labor action on teaching and learning against abandonment. Panelists will share their reflections and insights on ways of thinking about learning in the current context, considering the corporatization, neoliberal settler colonial context, considering the neoliberal settler colonial context of the university, and can it be transformed? Is it possible to move beyond the university to imagine something different? What could this look like, and what should we be doing to make learning spaces free, learning spaces and spaces for freedom and livability? Today, we have three esteemed panelists. Our first speaker is Professor Eve Haque. Professor Haque is the York University Research Chair in Linguistics, Diversity, Community Vitality at York. She's also the co-editor of Topia, a Canadian journal for critical, oops, sorry, something's on my screen. I'll say that again. She's also the co-editor of Topia, a Canadian journal of cultural studies. She also does a bunch of other stuff that you can probably find on Google if you'd really like to know. Our second speaker is Gina Starblanket, an associate professor in the Indigenous Studies and Governance program at the University of Victoria, and is the former Canada Research Chair in Politics of Decolonization at the University of Calgary. Gina is Cree and a member of the Starblanket Cree Nation in Treaty 4. She's the principal investigator of the Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network, and her research takes up questions of treaty implementation, Prairie Indigenous life, gender, and Indigenous feminisms. She's the editor of Making Space for Indigenous Feminisms, 3rd edition, forthcoming with Fernwood Press in May of 2024, and the co-author of Storying Violence, Unraveling Colonial Narratives in the Stanley Trial by ARP Press, 2020. And we also have Professor Andrea A. Davis, a professor in the Department of Humanities and chair of the Senate Academic Policy and Planning Research Committee, the APPRC. She teaches and supervises in literature and she teaches and supervises in literatures and culture of Black Americans, and holds cross appointments in the graduate program of English, Interdisciplinary Studies, Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies, and Social and Political Thought. She's the author of Horizons, Sea, Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critique of Nation, Northwestern Press. And she's currently co-editing with Leslie Saunders, The Handbook of Black Canadian Literature. So I'd like to go ahead and welcome our three speakers today. Thank you so much. And Professor Haque, if you'd like to start.
Thank you very much, Idil, for that lovely introduction. I just want to say I'm speaking to you all today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And of course, it is also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're also about 5,700 miles from Gaza, but we're also there in many ways today. So please indulge me. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes. I want to talk to you about academic freedom today. And I want to begin by something that happened on October 17th, when the Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, gave a lengthy speech in the Ontario legislature. You can watch it online. There's all this kind of video circulating of the speech. In this speech, she reads out the names of a number of students and faculty members. She says this is a deliberate act on her part, and that she wants their names recorded permanently in Hansard because she accuses these people of being supporters of terrorists and supporters of, quote, rape, torture, and mass murder. Anybody who's read the accused's ascribed statements can see this is untrue. However, these are Jill's deliberate misrepresentations of these statements. After reading out the students' names, she moves on to the naming of faculty members in Ontario universities. Each of these faculty members are identified also by institution, and decontextualized citations of their work statements are given as examples of her word, glorification of violence and justification of what she calls sexual violence. Again, these are her misreadings of their work statements and citations. All these people she names are then labeled as, in her word, anti-Semites. Jill Dunlop knows what the implications of reading out people's names publicly and into a permanent state record means. She's no mere anonymous online troll setting these people up for doxing, which of course has happened to many of these people already and continues to happen, but she is throwing the weight of the government behind this Speech Act, and it is this force that gives these misreadings and misrepresentations the truth value, which will permanently consign these people to becoming targets of a range of threats and violences. Of course, professional discreditation, exclusion to, especially in the case of students, perhaps expulsion, and for international students, perhaps even loss of study permits and deportation. But let's be clear, this discursive work is always required for threats and violence, even physical violence, to unfold, as Professor Jasmine Zeen's recent article in The Conversation shows us. This is what our Minister of Colleges and Universities has done. She ends her statements with a threat that all those who are bringing this, in her words, hate to campuses, quote, will be held to account by her. Both the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, or OCUFA, and the Canadian Association of University Teachers, CAUT, issued statements in the aftermath of Dunlop's statement. Academic freedom for the faculty members was at the heart of their expressed concerns. Academic freedom is not the same as free speech or in Canada, free expression. However, these boundaries continue to be blurred in the legislature and university administrative rhetoric. Perhaps it is more useful to see academic freedom as a specialized subset of free expression, but instead of it being a charter right, academic freedom is guaranteed in our collective agreements or our MOUs, the Memorandums of Understanding. And it is a privilege enjoyed and exercised particularly by tenured faculty members. In their letter, OCUFA notes that these debates that are at the heart of academic freedom require the guarantee of safety. And CAUT, in their response to Jill Dunlop's speech, notes that those named professors have all denied that they're either anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas. There's no question that academic freedom is a fundamental requirement for the kind of work that we have to do on our campuses. And all these, and that is our research and our teaching and learning. All these, sorry, I've lost my place. On campuses, all these activities take place in many forums and has many expressions. There are many definitions of academic freedom, but most faculty associations and unions in Canada use the CAUT definition, which defines academic freedom as offering broad protections for teaching, research, and extramural speech, as well as the explicit freedom from institutional censorship. That is, you can criticize the university, and that is what I am doing. The Universities Canada definition of academic freedom affirms faculty freedom to research and teach, as well as students' freedom to learn, and underscores institutional autonomy while distinguishing between freedom of speech from academic freedom. All these elements of academic freedom were under attack in the minister's speech. As CAUT stated, by publicly naming and pronouncing judgment on the professors, she prejudiced their rights to due process and irreparably damaged their reputation. CAUT explains these were not statements based on facts of what was said, but rather conjecture premised on decontextualized fragments of social media postings and other postings. Academic freedom rights are guaranteed mainly under our collective agreement and MOU rights. So, coupled with the rights of institutional autonomy, this means that our academic freedoms are not to be found on the floor of any legislature in the inflamed rhetoric of an unfortunate appointment to this ministerial position. So how does academic freedom operate? These official definitions, ratified through various institutions, lay out the arenas of guarantees for the exercise of academic freedom. But not only is academic freedom not a singular football of guarantees that we can tussle over, but these arenas of academic freedom are also not marketplaces of ideas to where we can submit any and all arguments equally. As I have argued elsewhere, academic freedom is most often seen as a one-size-fits-all guarantee, irrespective of the distribution of the cost of the exercise of this freedom. But I maintain that it has its own specific genealogy and its distribution is born asymmetrically. In the one-line statement by our faculty association, let me read it to you. UFA strongly supports academic freedom, as does the collective agreement. In this statement, all mention of Palestine is studiously avoided, and the focus is solely on an atomistic idea of academic freedom. In fact, there are many statements currently emerging and circulating that are solely focused on academic freedom. But given that academic freedom is embedded in relations of power, it can never be unanchored to the social and political context within which that guarantee of academic freedom is demanded. In many ways, academic freedom is an easy thing for our various union bodies and units to focus on. After all, we're fighting for our own freedom of expert expression, as if it is hived off from the struggles currently underway in Palestine. The administration of York University is issuing statements asserting that our freedoms are not absolute, that they have limits, and that they come with responsibilities. But the responsibility of academic freedom is not to a defanged version of social justice presented as an EDI flower to our various faculty councils, because, it was in a diagram that looked like a flower. But it is the responsibility of academic freedom, rather, as Robert C. Post, who is a former dean of Yale Law and the author of a book on academic freedom, other writings, has argued, the exercise of academic freedom must be based on expert content-based discrimination, which draws on the rigors of relevant disciplines. And this expertise can be found amongst various campus stakeholders. Because again, academic freedom is never content-free. So statements that just assert our academic freedom without qualification do not confirm the guarantees we need, in particular right now, as we seek to exercise our academic freedom on the topic of Palestine. The limits of expression that York administration point to are the ones that they have arbitrarily imposed. These have not been subject to content discrimination, our expert content discrimination that academic freedom guarantees. And what of the academic freedoms of our students to learn? Whatever expressions these may take, nowhere has this been more visible than at York campus, where student group statements have been turned into an unprecedented and public disciplining of our students and their various representative groupings. And this is not just to the York community, but through mainstream media, social media, into the wider national community. Hence the danger to them, of course, through doxing and other means. To date, we've had 4 statements from the university administration with the disciplinary measures against the students and the timelines for their accounting increasingly elaborated. These statements are not only individually sent to all members of the York community into their email inboxes, but they're also recirculated and amplified through mainstream and social media. This repeated public exposure of the disciplining and punishing measures that are to be enacted against these students are performative statements that constitute only some communities on our campus as worthy of care and support, and others as targets of discipline and punishment. In 2010, Mary Jo Nadeau and Alan Sears wrote a letter and upping the ante. In this letter, they described the ongoing silencing campaigns on campuses and beyond that label any criticism of Israel's policies as anti-Semitism, and the characterization of these criticisms as exceptional, irrational, and dangerous. Still, so many years later, we can see these processes at work in these York administrative statements. In these statements, there's much talk of creating safe environments for sharing of different perspectives. But when these statements begin with the repetition of disciplinary measures and surveillance to be taken against students, they contradict their own statement assertions of creating a safe and caring campus for all. These administrative statements outline the facilitation of Toronto Police Services onto York campus, justified as a safety mechanism. Safety for whom? We now know to ask. So this couple with Jill's repeated warnings that she's going to be watching us and hold us to account, and hold those to account, actually, who she gets to define as hateful on our campuses, then we know whose safety is not a priority and who will be subject to surveillance and scrutiny. As a statement from the chairs and directors of the faculty of LAPS states, and I'm para-quoting here, it is very concerning that York administration would assume without consultation of any kind and on behalf of the university to take drastic action against elected members of student groups at the university. Students are often at the center of institutional statements. After all, in the name of students, all kinds of higher ed institutional business is carried out. And in the era of performative EDI or JEDI or DEDI declarations, these statements are part of the strategy of the institutional brand management, as well as the management of our demands for radical social justice. And therefore, students become both the rhetorical and real volleyballs in these dangerous games. But as well, there's an undertow to these games, which also pull in precarious, untenured, and particularly in this moment of anti-Palestinian racist hysteria, also Black and brown Muslim faculty as targets. Islamophobia has been and continues to be a real threat on our campuses, this campus, but in this moment, the fear of its flare-up as an extension of anti-Palestinian racism is very real by our faculty and our students. So, in the administrative inflammation and escalation, this crisis has exceeded its student target, which in and of itself, of course, should be enough to cause concern. But it has also sent out a chilling notice for these particular groups of faculty. But we still speak and we still act. The Race Equity Caucus at York identified this crisis immediately, and although our caucus chair reached out and then waited in vain for our progressive, radical, lefty, this is self-defined, colleagues to speak up, when, as she said, and I quote, our white colleagues could not agree, we put our own statement together, and it is still in circulation. Please find it and sign it. When our union, UFA, also continued to not issue any statement, again, we waited in vain for a statement from our colleagues and ended up writing our own to circulate and send to UFA. The result was the tepid one-liner I mentioned earlier. Perhaps I am an idealist or an impatient shamer trying to prod others into action here. If that is what it's going to take for me to try to get people to act now, then let it be so. We can, of course, have a diversity of tactics. Someone else can cajole action with samosas. Our campus is in crisis, a crisis that is wholly a part of the larger national global crisis we are embedded and implicated in. In the exercise of our academic freedom, we need to do our work across the various arenas that academic freedom guarantees. That is, in our teaching, research, service, and learning. We can even be organizing events, actions, or perhaps creating platforms for those experts who can address precisely the issues that are sparking our campus, ideally experts who are not under NDA and therefore unable to answer our direct questions. This is what we must do. This and other things, of course, are what we must do in the exercise of our academic freedom if we are to help the very students, and by extension, also these variously precariously positioned faculty. Leaving it to the very faculty and students who are at the sharp end of surveillance and reprisal to speak out and lead on this issue is an all too familiar tactic of the withering white left. In this moment, academic freedom needs to be linked to an exercise of collective action, both York campus as well as beyond solidarities. Academic freedom is not an evenly distributed freedom in its exercise, even with our collective agreement guarantees. Some of you who have been paying attention will know this, right? And some of us will have this freedom sharply curtailed, chilled to non-existence. These statements are meant to do this chilling, these statements from administration are meant to do this chilling work because, as Nadeau and Sears reminds us, it is a tactic of an ongoing silencing campaign. So, as in all effective movements, it is not only in working in solidarity with various campus stakeholders and beyond that we can accomplish anything meaningful and useful at all. Let me end by going back to Jill Dunlop. She said in her speech, these individuals thought they could hide behind the ivory tower. Well, it's time for them to touch grass. She does so. In this speech, she did what all bullies do. From the safe perch of her seat at the legislature, she singled out individuals for attack. And ironically enough, for a minister of colleges and universities, she also denigrates our campuses as ivory towers and a shelter for hateful individuals. She tells us it's time to touch the grass. I have no idea what she means by that. It sounds vaguely threatening to me. I don't know, and right now I don't care. What I do care about is that we're all on the ground, grassy or not. And my colleagues currently are at York campus at a rally, and that we're all on the ground at our ivory towers on our campuses, collectively working against these attempts to bully us into silence, to undercut our ability to research, teach, learn, and share what we know about white settler colonialism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as their entanglements, historical and contemporary, about state violence, imperialism, war, genocide, occupation, anti-colonial movements, decolonization. That's the real decolonization, not the EDI decolonization, and so on. Let's exercise our academic freedom. Let's move beyond just statements of assertion that we have academic freedom. We know we do. UFA told us it's in our collective agreement. But let's understand that this is not some unfettered freedom enjoyed easily and uniformly by all, but one that is currently also yoked to the social and political context of what our union has reductively called the conflict in the Middle East. Academic freedom exists in its repeated content-specific and politically attuned exercise. Let's stop talking about it. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Eve. That was really great. Thank you. Gina, you're up next. Thank you.
Thanks, Idil. I just want to start by thanking Beverly for the invite. Thanks, Idil, for chairing this for us, and for Eve and Andrea, or to Eve and Andrea, for joining me today in this discussion. I really appreciated hearing your words, and hopefully I can follow that in a way that does this work some justice. So I am situated today. I just want to start out by acknowledging that I'm situated on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, and that includes the Songhees, the Esquimalt people, and also acknowledge the Wasanic people for their relationships with this place. I, as Idil mentioned, I'm Cree and Soto, and I'm from Treaty 4 territory. And so those are the lands that I am visiting from, and that I hold responsibilities and obligations to in my work, and always trying to enact those, as well as my responsibilities to local communities as we undertake this work. So today I wanted to talk to you about the canon, really, and how it figures in the work that I do, and specifically the racist, sexist, and colonial nature of the canon, how it continues to hamstring many of us who consider ourselves to be activist scholars and who are committed towards transformation in the work that we do. So to start with this, I'm just going to have to historicize what I'm talking about briefly, and then just work into a discussion of how I see some of these issues manifesting in my own discipline, and how what some of my reflections and thoughts are on the possibilities for change. So as many of you know, or all of you know, academia in many ways is grounded upon racist and sexist foundations ideologically, but also politically, but specifically grounded upon an understanding of Indigenous people that mirrors our relationship with settler states. And what I mean by that is the colonial nature of our relationship is mirrored in academia, both in terms of its foundations and its ongoing processes. So what I mean by this is the ways in which the governance systems of settler states are constructed from their very emergence upon imperial and racialized logics, which situate Indigenous people in a subordinate position, both as human beings, but also as citizens, eventual citizens of this constructed state. And so as individuals, we are regarded through this racialized frame, but also this colonial frame, which reproduces the logic of Indigenous inferiority and specifically Indigenous incapacity with respect to our ability to govern. And so in my discipline, we see this sort of perceived lack of civilization, this perceived lack of encoded governance structures and mechanisms for implementation that settlers observed upon first contact as being the sort of root cause or the root of how they legitimatized the imposition of settler structures of law and order over and on top of Indigenous governance systems. So these logics not only construct Indigenous people as incapable of political action and organization in practice, but also at an intellectual level. And so they situate us as incapable of deep intellectual and philosophical engagement with questions surrounding our own way of life and futures. And that includes forms and practices of governance, questions of political authority and legitimacy, practices of negotiation, contestation, conflict resolution, the framing of political problems and solutions, and other critical questions relating to governance. So not only our political systems, but our knowledge of the political find themselves absolutely excluded, and then over time only marginally included and in a very assimilatory and extractive way. And here I'm still talking about the state, but again, I'm also talking about the ways in which institutions mirror that dynamic. So Indigenous people from early on remain either absent from the quote unquote formal political dialogues and practices of the settler state, even those that impact our political status, such as the design of Indian policy. And then over time, when we are engaged, we're only engaged as subordinate actors relative to settler states. That is, as political subjects who perhaps hold rights that may be recognized and or alienated from us through the exercise of our political practices, such as treaty making and through the formation of political agreements, but who can also be denied the means for exercising agency in dialogue and policy decisions surrounding the future directions of those relationships. So while we might be subjects of inquiry eventually within academia and specifically within the discipline of political science, we still do not represent to the discipline agents or authors of our own theories of governance, right? We're continually regarded as subjects rather than the fully agential political partners that many of us envisioned we would be engaged with when we entered into treaties and other political relationships and agreements. So in my own discipline, as I've mentioned, I was trained as a political scientist. The stance that's assumed by the settler state is reflected in disciplinary engagements with Indigenous people, where, again, I'm talking about the discipline of poli-sci, we have figured only recently and marginally as subjects of inquiry. So historically, and I'll just clarify here, Indigenous people were entirely absent from theories of governance and, the canons that exist within the discipline, even if we've constituted subjects of inquiry in disciplines such as anthropology, right? We've been absent from political science for a very long time. And Kevin Brunel refers to this as a constitutive absence, right? Something that is part of the discipline's very foundation from its emergence and part of how it constitutes itself up and against Indigenous political claims. So over time, this absence there's efforts to fill this gap and to attend to this absence. And we have seen Indigenous people begin to receive increased attention in certain political science departments and programs, particularly in Western Canada. But this shift has been limited in many contexts to create the creation of space for Indigenous content, for Indigenous case studies, and to some degree for the implementation of Indigenous, community-based, or decolonial methodologies. But the increase in writing relating to Indigenous people and politics that we've seen in recent decades hasn't necessarily been mirrored by a substantive transformation of the discipline. And what I mean by that is its foundations, its assumptions, and importantly, research and publication processes. So what we mean here, and I'm drawing on some work, as I'm thinking through this, some work that I'm doing on sovereignty and questions of sovereignty with two Indigenous colleagues, Matt Wildcat at the University of Alberta and Morgan Mowat, who's a postdoctoral fellow here at UVic. And we're actually doing some work right now on thinking about this exact question, right, of what the state of Indigenous politics is like relative to the broader discipline and institution. So what I'm getting at in this work is that the increase in quantity of political science scholarship has not signaled an epistemological shift, an ontological shift that indicates either a greater depth of engagement with Indigenous knowledges on the one hand, or a willingness for critical self-reflection and engagement with the discipline's own imperial approach to knowledge on the other hand. So we might have scholars, and increasingly see scholars, that are seeking to understand, identify, and deliberate the existence of an Aboriginal or Indigenous right, but not necessarily relative to our knowledge as Indigenous people about our own inherent rights and responsibilities. So it's being assessed through frames and through metrics that are still informed by Western knowledge. And I'll give you an example here, just circling back to the work I was talking about on sovereignty. We might see scholars who are trying to gauge and discuss and inquire into whether Indigenous people have a right to sovereignty comparable to those of settler states, such as Canada and the US. But again, they're still drawing on a Western statist definition of sovereignty rather than on the terms and contexts that are informed by Indigenous knowledge. And so what I mean there is Indigenous people on the ground articulate and use the language of sovereignty to assert a range of claims around agency and jurisdiction over various sites, ranging from the body to food systems to lands. But really, that sort of language is being used as an enabling mechanism for assertions of political life that exist outside of those formal structures of the state. And so you can't actually assess one based on the other, right? You have to situate and engage with Indigenous politics on the terms, on the definitions that we set out, and in the context in which that term is being articulated and advanced. So the part of my work is thinking through what are the limits when we as Indigenous scholars and non-Indigenous allies who are committed to decolonial change and transformation are constantly being asked to situate our interventions in relation to the canon, right? What are the implications? And I argue, in a number of different places, that the advancement of critical dialogues and exchanges in Indigenous politics will always be hamstrung if contemporary scholars are forced to ground our analyses in relation to the existing discipline, but specifically in relation to the canon, which emerges within a tradition that is meant to both absent Indigenous people entirely, but also has the impact over time of eclipsing the significance of our own intellectual traditions, right? If we're constantly having to speak back to this canon in order to make our works legible and situate our work within disciplinary frames, in order for it to have traction and resonance and for it to go through peer review, there's going to be over time an assimilatory and integrative impact on our own knowledges, because we're being asked to take them out of context, to perhaps think about them through more universal frames that are not entirely representative of how we understand those concepts and seek to use them, and then extracts that in a sense in efforts to try and universalize that knowledge and bring it across elsewhere. So what I'm trying to get across here is that, it's the issue isn't that, we're unable to engage with the canons or that we're unable to engage in sustained critiques. Many of us do precisely this, particularly when it's relevant to our own projects and analyses and arguments, but that this can't be where we dedicate the bulk of our intellectual energy. Sometimes our works are simply not connected to these canons. And so drawing on them would absolutely take away from the potential to imagine, new ideas and bring forward new interventions. But it would also further entrench the primacy of those dominant disciplinary frames and vocabularies and normative terms in ways that are counter to the transformation that many of us seek. So a big part of what I argue for in my own work, and I recognize I'm running out of time here, is to ground our work in a diversified range of approaches and knowledge sources from across and outside of the academy. We have to, and the discipline, if it's willing to change, if it's going to change, has to be willing to attend to its own imperial foundations, and that not as a product of history or just as some historical phenomenon, but the ways in which these actively play out in the everyday. We have to be self-reflexive about the implications of our own theories and practices on our diverse relations who exist across locations. But importantly, and what I really want to emphasize is that our own knowledge as Indigenous people stands on its own. And when you talk about futures and talk about, what might knowledge production look like decoupled from academia, I'm constantly thinking of, what it would look like, how we might be able to engage intellectual production within our own communities in ways that aren't tethered to and resourced by academia, right? So many of us as Indigenous people become tethered to these sites of university or these university settings, these urban spaces, which, while, beautiful and amazing in many ways, they create really important sites of community in many ways. I always wonder what it would look like to read and think and write in a way that was unbounded, in a way that just really let me saturate myself in the contexts that I'm writing about. And so I really want to emphasize the importance of context, and particularly the place-based cultural contexts of Indigenous nations as the relevant foundations for knowledge. And specifically, thinking about that knowledge in relation to the lands and the waterways and the elements of creation that exist in those spaces, right? In the place that knowledge emerges from. And so I just, really want to emphasize that. There's one, I think the risk when we don't do that is that there is this danger, and I'm seeing this, and I want to just note it as well. When these sort of concepts in Indigenous politics get taken out of their own terms and context, there is this particular danger here for Indigenous political traditions and concepts to be reduced to something of a conceptual resource when they are decontextualized from the way in which we give meaning to them and take them up across locations, across different moments in time, and from different subjectivities as well. And so, really, I think taking it, transformation for me means taking Indigenous knowledge seriously in these contexts. And in many respects, it's quite simple, right? It's not actually that complicated. It means thinking about our own philosophical resources, drawing on those, taking seriously our own sites and sources of knowledge, working towards resourcing our own thinkers, our own theorists, our own policymakers and artists and creators, right? In ways that aren't always contingent on institutional funding. So I'll end there. I know I've been going on, and I have a lot to say, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gina. Next, I'd like to invite Andrea Davis. Thank you so much, Andrea, and welcome.
Muted. Thank you so much, Idil, for the generous introduction, and thank you to my colleagues, Eve Haque and Gina Starblanket, for their really necessary and important interventions and contributions to thinking about what it means to work in the academy. I am coming to you today from the town of Newmarket, just north of Toronto, situated on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples whose presence continues here to this day. For the last few weeks, I have been pondering, like many of us, about what it means to live in a wounded world. Specifically, I have been forced to reckon with and think deeply about what it means to be a scholar and writer, working and thinking within an epoch-defining moment that has challenged my sense of the possibilities of the world and the university. Of everyone on this panel, I have been most involved formally at the institutional level, trying to define a framework for the building of a more just university. As chair of the Department of Humanities, I began that work through a project of diversifying the curriculum out of a belief that if the university is to be transformed, we need to dislodge long-held colonial and white supremacist ways of thinking. And since these ways of thinking have been enshrined in philosophical thought, literature, and history as a world-making project, then the work of dismantling these thought systems needed to take place in the humanities and not just the social sciences. In doing that work, I collaborated with students and colleagues to develop a Black Canadian Studies certificate. We're now developing a major, and facilitated the move of Indigenous Studies to the Department of Humanities. As inaugural special advisor on anti-Black racism strategies in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, a role I took on after the murder of George Floyd and while I was on sabbatical, I could see the wound in the world, but also the place, as Sufi mystic and poet Rumi once wrote, where the light enters you. I saw that light in the wound as an opening for a different set of possibilities. I saw this opening in 2020 in the galvanizing of young and old people, racialized and white people, straight, queer, trans, and two-spirit people, and people across faith beliefs. All over the world for a moment, many of us were insisting on a world free of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms and calling for the abolition of the police. It was within this context that I participated in the first scholar strike and numerous teach-ins. That year, my faculty and university also launched a series of targeted Black hires, and I met with every candidate in my faculty and often outside the faculty to talk about the possibilities for their work in that moment and what they could help to build. Many of them were being invited into departments where they were the only one or one of a very small number of Black faculty, and many of these hires were difficult and contentious. Most recently, as academic convener of the Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, I pushed for a fundamental culture shift that saw Indigenous and Black thought and cultures centered for the first time in 92 years. Some of us believed then that we had created another opening, no matter how small, no matter how late, that our labor was contributing something tangible to the project of disrupting the hard casing of elite universities, that we had made another opening through which light might shine despite the horrific history of violence in educational systems in this country. I think in particular of the moving lecture by Abenaki filmmaker Alanis Obomsawin. But now 5 months later, it feels like the wound is festering. For those of us who are Indigenous, Black, or otherwise racialized or minoritized, who have been asked to fix systems we have not broken, heal wounds we did not create, the work is unending and exhausting. It's critical that we make an ongoing assessment of why we do this work and toward what ends. Is it possible, for example, to do this work without reproducing harm? I think, for example, about the Indigenous and Black scholars hired over the last 3 or so years who have been forced to teach and research largely in isolation, who upon their immediate arrival in university departments, most of them just having completed a PhD, were being asked to establish Indigenous and Black studies programs or sit on a multitude of committees in the name of equity, diversity, and inclusion, even while their peers continue to misunderstand or not care about their work or intervene strategically to silence their voices. Many of these new colleagues now are looking for ways to leave these jobs. Canadian universities, having been told that representation matters, believe they have responded by inviting Indigenous and Black scholars into the academy. And since these scholars were not here before, there is this unspoken sense that they should be grateful for this opportunity to enter the sacrosanct corridors of university education and teaching, while very little effort has been made to grapple with what it means to fundamentally alter colonial and white supremacist value systems, thought systems, and systems of world making that are at the core of the way the university operates. This is why it is so important when we're trying to do this kind of decolonial work that we push for the hires of full professors and not just pre-tenured faculty who are deeply vulnerable and exposed disproportionately, like other precarious teachers in the university, to the vicissitudes of race and power. I think also about the ways in which the language of justice often gets co-opted and turned against the very project of liberation we're trying to enact. How even the Black Studies programs we have been asked to create can be co-opted into a project of white supremacist knowledge production and systematically undermined. In how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in our unbearable wrongness of being. Sylvia Winter traces the establishment of the first Black Studies programs in the United States to the 1968 murder of Martin Luther King Jr., not dissimilar to Canadian universities' response to the protests following the murder of George Floyd. Yet she also notes that Black Studies' radical possibility in the ushering in of a new kind of world was quickly undercut, their original transgressive intentions diffused, and their energies rechanneled so they could be used to re-verify the very thesis of liberal universalism they had tried to dismantle in the first place. Within a context of neoliberal demands where universities are required to not just be sustainable, but to generate profit, where students have become clients who are paying for a service rather than lifelong learners. The generation of financial and social capital as measured in student enrollments and the ability to attract large donors outweighs all other values. In this context, equity, diversity, and inclusion are relevant only to the extent that they allow universities to compete and to sell their brand, which is the way all capitalist organizations function. What are the possibilities for real change within this context? I have come to realize in the last 3 years that more than anything else, a more just university will need to be brave. A model of a just university will need to not only enact principles of justice, but to believe in and defend those principles in the face of resistance, which will most certainly come. And my colleague Eve Haque has already talked at length about academic freedom. A model of a more just university must also refuse the historical competitive models assumed in the mobilization of knowledge, in particular the ways in which the scholarship of Indigenous and Black scholars are used to shore up prestige rankings of universities, even as many of these scholars work in isolation and under duress. We need to break down those exclusionary and artificial borders, and as Indigenous and Black scholars look for and demand greater opportunity to work in collaboration across these universities, and to also break down the borders of the university to put the knowledge we generate in service of the communities to which we belong, as Gina has so eloquently argued. I close by returning to where I started as a reflection of what it means to live, think, and work in a wounded world, by leaning into abolitionist Mariam Kaba's definition of hope as discipline. I'm not going to pretend that I have answers, that we are not all right now deeply wounded, but I continue to believe that honest and deep self-reflection, careful and thoughtful conversation, a willingness to learn and unlearn, all values central to the goals of the scholar strike interventions organized over the past several years, creates a different kind of opening for a different kind of light that may be piercing, sometimes uncomfortable, but is required if we are to live in and be in this world. I'm deeply appreciative of this space created by Beverly and others to bring that light to bear. Thank you so much to my colleagues, to everyone listening, trying to live in this difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. Thank you, Eve, and thank you, Gina. This brings our final session in Scholar Strike of 2023 to an end, and I'd like to just give a few thank yous before we leave today. Firstly, thank you to all of you who've participated in Scholar Strike by listening and sitting with us. As Andrea said, during a time when many of us are wounded and the world continues to be a wounded place. We thank you for showing up. We thank the panelists, the moderators, students. We also thank those who have made today happen, specifically the Scholar Strike Planning Committee, the ASL interpreters and ASL services. We thank our tech team and students, Justine, Jen, as well as Rejan. We also thank Min Suk Lee and Bev Bain, who initially started Scholar Strike Canada. And we also, again, want to thank all of the people who funded Scholar Strike Canada, as well as the organizations who continue to support the work of Scholar Strike. It takes a lot of work to bring this together, and so we thank those who've taken the time during this difficult time for all of us to do this work, and we hope that we continue to do this work going forward. Thank you so much, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening.